Hi, everybody, and welcome to FBC Missions So That podcast. Today, I have Teresa Moen with me. She's actually going to interview me about Perspectives and the Lesson 5 class that I was the instructor for. So I'm excited. I hope you guys enjoy. Hi, and welcome to Season 4 of FBC Missions So That podcast. This is an encouraging place to hear how God is working in and around us. We know that He blesses His people so that they can bless the world around them. And we're going to be discussing how to join God in all that He is doing. Why is God working in our life, church, and community? It's so that through us, the world will know that He is near. Hey, everybody, and welcome to the podcast today. We're so glad that you've joined us. I have with me Teresa. How you doing, Teresa?
Doing great. How about you, Chad?
I'm doing great. I think this is the first time that you've been on the podcast with me.
It's very true. It's my first experience in the podcast room.
I'm so excited. You're one of my favorite people, and I'm so glad to have you with me today. Today's a kind of a funny one because I recruited you to interview me about the instructor lesson I did a few weeks back for Perspectives. So are you up to the task?
I'm ready. I have my list, and I am ready.
Well, hey, before we jump into that, just tell our listeners a little bit about yourself. How does Teresa get into this place?
Well, I am, good question. I'm the minister to children here at FBC, and I am also a Perspectives student. So this is my first time doing Perspectives, and I have loved it. I've teased Chad a lot about the amount of reading and homework.
Oh, come on.
It's true. But I will say I've learned so much, and it has given me such fresh eyes for what sharing the gospel is all about. So I've loved that. So hopefully I can share that with our families and our children.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, you have no idea how much of an encouragement you are to me by being in the class, by being one of the students. You and Gary, I feel like I'm dragging you guys through this. Gary more so than you, but it's been a lot of fun to have you guys with us. And my daughters, especially Allie, just loves you, Teresa. Thank you so much for the way that you care for her and listen to her, how you see her. It really is an incredible thing. We love you very much, and we're so glad that you're here. And I'm sure so many of the listeners know you well as well, and we're so thankful for your work among our kids. So thanks. Thank you for being here. Perspectives, it's just a wild thing, and it really is a big undertaking. You've been hearing, if you've been listening to the podcast, you've been hearing about Perspectives as we've gone through some of the lessons this year. But it really is, it really has an impact on the people going, and we'll definitely have some of those stories later on this year as well. Let me ask you before we jump in, why did you take the class apart from Chad's immense pressure?
I'm definitely a homebody girl. So other than going to adopt my 3 children from Guatemala and go to Canada and Mexico, I've really never gone on outside of the U.S. missions trip. And really what I learned culturally about sharing the gospel in other parts of the world, I had no idea. I mean, I was definitely ignorant, oblivious about it. And so I've just learned a ton about it. And I think I've kind of been intimidated by it, and so this was definitely a fire hose experience, but it was super powerful for me. So I learned things I never even thought about. So it's been great.
Well, thank you for that, and I'd like to unpack that more. She's got to turn in her paper here in the next few days, and I can't wait to read it. So that's like the culmination of the class is a 5 or 6 page paper, and I've gotten to read some. Some people are turning them in already, and it's so fun, so exciting to see how people interact with what God's doing around the world, and they put themselves into it. It's such a cool thing. So, all right, I know you've got some questions. Our focus is Lesson 5, and that the name of that lesson is Unleashing the Gospel. And I've been blessed to teach that lesson, 7 or 8 times over the years, and it's definitely one of my favorites. And so you've got some questions. Let's jump into this.
All right. Well, my first one was really to have you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you think God has gifted you and wired you as a leader in the missions movement over the past however many years. And if you ever had that aha moment where you're like, oh my goodness, this is what God has called me to, and this is why He's made me.
That's a lot, but I love it. I love it. And there's a really cool story right in the middle of this, and it involves perspectives. So it's shocking, right? So when I became a believer, this is all the way back to the beginning. It was 5th grade. I went to a youth camp. And the missionary at the youth camp it was a missionary speaker at the youth camp, and he had all these, slideshows. You guys remember those things? So you hit the button and it changes and the slide pops. It wasn't a slideshow like PowerPoint. It was the old slides.
Oh, slideshow.
Yeah, actual
Real
slideshow.
Okay.
But he also had spears and all this cool stuff,
cool.
like a headdress from Africa. And at that time, I'm a 5th grade kid living in Arkansas. That's very exotic and very different, and very strange. And he talked about this God that could change lives in Africa. And he's talked about all these stories of how God was moving in people's lives. And I thought, man, if he can change lives in Africa, maybe he can change lives in Arkansas. And so I went to the front. I prayed the sinner's prayer. I became a believer. And that really, from the beginning, I feel like gave me this like a missions bent. Like there's this interest in the world and the globe and these things happening in other parts of the world. And so I always was interested in hearing the missionaries talk or reading a missionary story or something. So I was homeschooled later on, and in homeschooling, I would finish my schoolwork within an hour of the day, and then I would have the whole day to try to figure out what am I going to do. And so we would go to the library, and I would just grab handfuls of books. And, it was one of those summers I read through all the Hardy Boys. I tried Nancy Drew, couldn't get into it. It was just too girly.
Definitely
but all of the 140 or so, the Hardy Boys books, I could read 2 or 3 of them in a day. That was, and so then someone said, well, hey, you should read some missionary stories. So I just start go to the library and ask, what are some missionary stories? And someone gives you some random name of a missionary. You just grab a book and read it. And they're always inspiring. Some of them are really devastating. It's hard. Some of them suffer tremendously. But I had this interest from an early age. So fast forward to the Army days. We traveled to Thailand. I saw kind of the worst side of Thailand through the Army. Like a lot of things that people shouldn't be doing is what the Army guys were doing. And I'm thinking, this is not good. So I think at that time I was probably very legalistic and very much kind of like, you need to come to Jesus to prevent going to hell, because if you stay on this route, you're in pretty bad shape.
Right.
I was kind of a judgmental, maybe arrogant Christian at the time. And so I saw Thailand in that form. Well, again, a couple of years later, I've gone to Bible college. I got a degree in education, not in ministry. I didn't do seminary, but I got my ed degree. I figured I could be a youth pastor and be a coach. I figured I would fund myself as a teacher and pastor some small, be a youth pastor of some small church. That was my plan. And only God knew I got hired by a pretty large church while I was in college to be their youth ministry, junior high youth pastor, and missions pastor.
Oh, wow.
So right away, I got to start taking teams on mission trips. We took a couple to Mexico, and I went one year. I took my team, the missions team of the church. We went through a missions festival. I've been a part of helping start this big conference. There was about 40 of us that were this inaugural team organizing it. And so I took my team, and we were walking through the big conference area with all the booths, and there's this big, giant missions book on a table, and a lady sitting there with a little banner that said Perspectives. And I love reading, right? I read all these stories, so the book drew me in.
Wow.
And
Only
I said,
only a few.
What is this? And I look at a few pages. She's like, oh, you've never heard of Perspectives? And she said, it's a missions class. I'm like, I graduated from Bible college, and I'm a missions pastor. What kind of missions class is there? And so she, of course, unpacked a little bit, and I had my missions team leader with me, and I said, we should do the class. And he's like, let's do it. We'll do it in the fall. And so we talked. There were 7 of us. So the whole missions team went through it.
Wow.
And Elise and I thought I probably knew all this stuff already, but it'd be really good for my missions team, so I'm going to be a good leader and go with them, right? That's and it just rocked my world.
Awesome.
I was a missions pastor when I took the class. And there was a word I learned halfway through the class that was a mobilizer. And that word changed my life, because up until then, every time I go on a mission trip, I was like, is this where God's calling me? Is this where God's calling me? Is this what I'm made for? Is this? So you land in Mexico or Thailand or Uganda or all these places we were going. And I really was just like so excited. And every time I was like, I don't think this is the place. But when I learned that word mobilizer, it's someone that stays home for the purpose of sending. It was like, this is what I am. I'm a networker. I'm a motivator. I'm a high energy person. And it really began to define my whole world. Mission world was defined as a mobilizer kind of from that point on. Of course, then I became a missionary. My wife and I moved to Mexico. Right. We lived in Mexico. I felt like it was a really key part of my development to try to get some field experience and learn what it looks like to be on the ground, living in another foreign environment. And it did. It again shook me up when I was there. But really, from that time, that word mobilizer has defined so much of the gifting that God has given me. Yeah,
I love that. I have been a believer since I was 12, 13. I don't think I've ever had anybody tell me a story from the Bible in relation to sharing the gospel and going and telling the world as a mobilizer.
Right.
But it's real. So
it is real. And honestly, you see so much of what Paul's doing, and you see like there's a season where you're heavy investing in evangelism. But then from there, the whole role of discipleship is to engage people's gifts and talents for the best purposes they have among the nations, right? It might be in their city, that's fine. But it may be to the ends of the earth. And the scope of our vision always has to be to those people that have never had the gospel, right? So,
right.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't ask you this wasn't on my list of questions, but it made me wonder, when you think about unleashing the gospel, do you have a favorite mission trip you've gone on where you think this was it? I mean, this served the purpose of, this was one of my favorites, and why?
Yeah, so several years back, we got to take a team to the Philippines, and what we were doing there was working with a group of pastors. They're all pastoring old churches. When I say old, 150, 170-year-old Baptist churches. They all were probably between 50 to 150 people, and there was about 120 pastors in this room. And we talked to them. We had been there for 3 years, so we made a commitment of 5 years of training these pastors. So the first 2 years, what we did was really, what I would say is kind of personal health, like how do you ensure that you're a healthy leader, and but it was very internal kind of focus. Well, year 3 we shifted to really saying, okay, now how do you engage lostness outside of you? And we started using this strategy. You've heard me talk about the 4 field strategy. Right. So we just training them through simple, basic gospel sharing tools. So, how do you share your testimony? See, these are all pastors. They're like, guys, like this is really basic. And say, okay, so tell us, what is your discipline of going out to the lost and sharing? And what was overwhelmingly true was what was true for me is that I had been for a long time a pastor. So I cared for a lot of Christians. And every now and then there'd be a non-believer come to our church, and we'd have a meeting, and I'd pray for him and lead him to faith in my office. But I had no discipline of going into places outside of my church where there were lost people and building relationships, staying with them, being with them, and encouraging them, mentoring them. And so the work of evangelism was something that I taught kind of as a theory, but not something that I practiced.
Oh, wow.
And so when I saw that in these other pastors, I said, let's figure out how to do this differently. And so we started talking about how do they go. Out of that 110, there was about 15 that decided to take on this training at a really high level. And so by the time we came back the following year, they had multiplied churches and villages that were outside of their church's footprint, but they had been going and sending and taking people with them and planting now kind of lay leader pastors into these other churches, these smaller churches in the villages. And within 2 to 3 years, that had grown where we saw 40, 50, 60 of these kind of moving outwards. And we realized that if that would continue, the saturation kind of picture that every little village outside could have a church in it within the next 5 to 10 years. And the other pastors started to say, the ones that didn't jump on, like, well, we're so busy taking care of the people in our church, we just don't have time for these things. You start realizing the capacity issue is the limitation for most churches. The leaders are overwhelmed. How can they add more people to their church body or to their flock, so to speak, if they don't have time to take care of the ones they already have? Right. And so we started working really hard with them. It was really neat. That period of 5 to 7 years, that network grew really exponentially. We saw probably 140 villages that had never had a church in them have small churches, and saw that network kind of really gaining momentum. And what really fun is that they're sending us text messages on WhatsApp, every week of new baptisms and new believers. Cool. And there was some crazy stories, like 13-year-old girl ministering to this 80-year-old widow woman in a village that was so excited. So she would go and play guitar with her and sing with her, and then tell her the gospel. And then her family started coming, and then that old lady hosted this little group in her house, and it was being led and discipled by this 13-year-old girl. And you're like, this is so different than the picture that we think of when we think of church planting in villages. And so now that little girl, 13-year-old girl, like 25, she's becoming famous as a musician in the Philippines. So it's really interesting to see her videos really cool. Now. It's in front of big crowds of 5,000 people. She's opening for a big act or something. Oh, wow. Pretty fun to see that transition, that movement for her. So
well, that's kind of cool. You got to see real live.
Yeah, of course.
Multiplication.
Of course. And we were there at the beginning. Like we said, hey, this is something we need to bring to this community. And see that kind of results out of it. So yeah, absolutely. It was super neat. That's a great
story. I love that. All right, so this lesson's called Unleashing the Gospel. I like to assume everybody knows what the gospel is, but I'm surprised sometimes by the number of believers I'll say to them, what is the gospel? and I get a lot of words, but not a lot of clarity. So I'm going to let you tell us what the gospel is for clarity.
I love it. I love it. So there's multiple places, and the gospel it's always funny. It's everything, and it's super complex, and it's also extremely simple, right? I love that Jesus says, repent, for the kingdom of God is at hand. That's like the easiest, simplest presentation. And there's two pieces of that. One is that we need help. We can't save ourselves, right?
For sure.
And the other thing is that God is drawn near. Mm-hmm. And that's like the picture. That's the craziest thing. It's the biggest unique thing about our faith is in every other faith you do so that God will be impressed. If you do enough, God will forgive you or God will welcome you.
Right.
But in Christianity, God draws near to us. He bridges the gap. He comes into the midst of our mess, and he's the one that redeems us. And so you've got the two pieces, the redemption, the repent, for the kingdom of God is at hand, and you've got the nearness of God. And so you think of these other little verses, confess with your mouth, Jesus is Lord, believe in your heart, God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. And you've got these two pieces. So this idea that I need him and he's near to me. And so when I say the basic, simplest form of the gospel is that God has drawn near to us. So our response is to ask him, forgive us for all the ways that we have chosen ourselves over him, and then trust that he is going to forgive us for it. You do those two things, and it draws us close to God. He is near to us, and then it starts a relationship, right? Once you're in that relationship, then you're learning, you're growing, you're transforming more into his likeness all the time. And so I think the gospel is super simple. Now, of course, you could talk about how the gospel changes society and culture, right, and it can go deep in a community, and all of the needs and the evil that you see is the gospel can undo. And that's very true.
That's true.
But it starts with these really simple steps of me saying, I'm not enough on my own and I need you. And God's saying, good, because I'm right here next to you. Let's do this.
And I love that it doesn't depend on us, because if it did, we'd be in a big world of hurt.
We are in such a big world of hurt, right? And Unleashing the Gospel. It's such a great title, and I'm excited to share a little more about that.
Good. All right. So, what does unreached people group? I learned this in Perspectives. You gave me a little sneak peek of it when you first came. Yeah. Again, remember, I'm super culturally saturated with knowledge, but not everybody knows that. So to a regular person, you talked a little bit about on your sermon, if somebody wants to catch that from Sunday, about an unreached people group. But it's pretty cool. I'd not really heard it explained to me like that before, so maybe you could touch on that for people. Yeah,
so it's a technical term in the mission world. It has a very clear, defined meaning, but it's used very messily within the world of Christianity. So not everybody, they use it all the time, the word unreached, but they don't necessarily use it the way that it's defined. So the definition is it's a group of people have the same culture, language, customs. It's a group of people that has never had access to the gospel. Technically, it means that there are less than 2% evangelical believers among them. And so you might think of the people group side of it, like people think of it like American Indians or Native American tribes. You have Cherokees and Apaches and Navajo, and they're all American Indians, but they're very different from each other.
Okay.
So if you said, we're going to go reach the American Indians, you could say, wait, there's like 500 different American Indian groups. Which one are you going to go to? And you're like,
right.
Because they have different language. One just can't talk to the other. They need translators to talk to each other, right? They have very different culture and customs. And so you realize that these people groups have their own unique kind of micro world that stays within itself. They stay closer to the same way that you like hanging out with people who are like you and look like you and act like you and speak like you. They do the same thing. But that means those natural barriers prevent the gospel from moving across those cultures easily. So there's places in the world, it's roughly a third of the world's population, 2.5 to 3 billion people that have never had access to the gospel where they live or in their own language. And so that's when unreached. So in the Bible, Matthew 28, go make disciples of all the nations. The word nations there in Greek is ethne, and that ethne is interpreted as all the people groups of the planet, right? So you think of Revelation 7, where it says that before God summoned people from every tribe, tongue, language, and nation. That's probably the better translation of go make disciples of all nations. It's really tribe, tongue, languages, and nations.
Right.
And so that's the unreached, the places where the gospel's never been. People that could be born, live their whole lives, and die, never hearing the gospel of Jesus, never meeting a Christian, never passing a church, never seeing a Bible in their language. And that's roughly a third of the planet.
Okay. And what I thought I learned from Perspectives, which I didn't know before, is that it used to be that we would deploy people to go to those places and make a difference and share the gospel and embrace their culture, their language, and all of that. But something strange is happening now. A lot of them are coming to us. So when I think about in Boerne, Texas, how could I reach an unreached people group? There's some here.
Yeah, it's really wild, and we're just starting to try to. I think I'm just now understanding that there are actually some unreached people groups that may even reside within our city.
Wow.
But there are the bigger ones that we get a lot of information about, like the Afghan refugees that are living in San Antonio, or there's a Gujarati community I'm just learning about that's there's 5,000 plus living in San Antonio. There's a Hindu temple in Helotes, and there's a possibility we could start engaging. That's a highly unreached people from India within 20 minutes of us. But even knocking on doors the other day with one of my friends, we met an Iranian girl whose dad was born in Iran, lives here in Boerne, and it's just incredible to know that even here, if I was to try to raise up a couple and send them as missionaries to Iran, it would be incredibly expensive and incredibly dangerous for them. And yet here we have Iranians living among us. So you just don't know. There are also other people groups here too. So
yes, I know. And
convenience store owners, you just go down the list of where you see international people in our city, and there's lots of them.
And that's a huge change. That wasn't how it was in the past, or at least not to the level that it is. Because that was my next question. Should we all get on a plane and head to these places you're talking about and share Jesus?
Yeah, the guy that founded Perspectives, named Ralph Winter, always said things like, don't go across the ocean if you can't cross your street. And it was kind of this idea, like, you have to be able to engage the world around you before you try to go cross-culturally into a world that's much more challenging, much more difficult, much more inaccessible because of those barriers, right? So no, absolutely. Like there will be some that God would call out from among us to go. But most of us, our mission field is our first mission field is our family, your oikos, your network, your neighbors, your friends, your coworkers, classmates. But yeah, even within that, there are cross-cultural opportunities right here within our own community that we should seek out, right? Yeah, we should be at least aware of, and if not, have some intentional engagement with them if it's possible.
Right. And I know that sounds a little scary, right? But like you said, there are tools, there's classes you can take to learn to do that.
Yeah,
and
of course.
There's a misnomer that happened in kids ministry when I was growing up, and I've heard it many times. I can just hear it now. We're in a setting with kids, and we're talking about missions, and we tell kids, everybody's a missionary.
Yeah.
And that got corrected for me in Perspectives, too, and I love it. So I want, anytime something like that happens, I want to share it so others can hear why is not everybody a missionary?
Yeah, that's another, like, everyone should be missional, right? We should all be living on mission. You hear those language all the time, but we've tried really hard to define the word missionary as someone who's going to a cross-cultural gospel engagement. So the difference between a like culture, even similar culture, to someone that's completely cross-cultural, the missionary has a very different task than you and I if we're going to go to our neighbors, our network, our friends. And so, yeah, it's I would definitely be careful not to call everyone a missionary, though everyone has a missional role. Everyone has a part to play in the missionary world. But yeah,
but
the same with unreached. Like, people say, oh, I have a lost friend. He's unreached. No, he's unchurched, right? That's a different. There's a big difference between an unreached person and an unchurched person. Right. And in Perspectives, you hear about E1, 2, and 3, E0 through 3, and you go, oh, okay, E2 and 3, I get. Now you're talking about cross-cultural engagement, and E0 and E1. Now we're talking about your like neighbors and similar cultures. But yeah, take Perspectives. You'll love it.
It's true. You'll learn so much.
You'll learn so much.
Well, and I would say too, I loved when you told me before about it. You said not everybody is a missionary, but everybody is an evangelist.
Yeah, everybody has a mission, right? Yes. Everyone's an evangelist. Everyone has an opportunity to share the love of Jesus with those around them.
Right. Yeah. I love that. I love that. I'm trying to figure out how to work that into our kids, because I do think they separate it. They think there's these people that go do that, and I either bring people to a pastor or somebody else to share, but I don't know how. So that's kind of one of my heart's desires for sure, as very early as we can, is to teach kids how to tell their story about Jesus changing their lives, and then how to share that story with their friends. And so they feel very comfortable with some of the tools that you guys have, Perspectives has, and some of the churches, to share the gospel and to feel comfortable to tell that unchurched person about, come to church. I don't need my pastor to tell you. Let me tell you what God's done for me. How my life is different.
Yeah, so you might think of, like, the task of a pastor is to equip the believers within his culture, right, to interpret the gospel to the people that live there.
Right.
The missionary's job is to do the same thing, but for a completely different culture altogether, right? So they're going to go and try to engage that culture, share the gospel, hopefully raise up new believers, and then start translating for those local believers how to be faithful so that they can engage the world around them. That becomes, again, now those believers are in their own culture, right? So now they're translating for their own people. That's what we do here. We want all believers, young and old, to be able to share the hope of Jesus in a relevant, meaningful, personal, transparent, kind, gentle way with the people that they see day in and day out. And so that's excellent. Yeah, thanks for asking that.
All right, so what are some of the challenges and strategies that are necessary when you're attempting to reach some of these unreached people groups, unreached ones? So we could talk about, because I know we had a speaker come that talked about Muslims, am I correct? Yeah. And I was like overwhelmed. I had no idea there were that many in San Antonio. And I went, I feel super ill-equipped to do anything with them. Now they have all kinds of, cool field trips they take you on and classes and whatever. But I'm like, boy, I am super uneducated on how to do this.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing. Like, people are people. Right. Like, this is one of the simple. If you're nervous, I would just tell you, step past that nervousness and find out that Afghans are just people. Right. And they're living in a country that's not their own. They're nervous. Anyone that's nice to them, they're going to be so thankful for them. So if it's Jehovah's Witnesses or Mormons or other Muslims or Christians, whoever it is, they're just going to be thankful that someone's nice to them. So rule one, be nice.
Yeah, they're foreigners, right?
Be nice to them. Be kind to them. Be welcoming to them. Be loving to them in some way. And in that, you're going to find opportunity just to build. So some of the most effective ministries that we can see happening, working specifically, let's say Afghan refugees in San Antonio, it's specific that they just go and care for them. They help them kind of navigate the system. What I mean, how do you get a kid registered for school in a culture? When you don't speak the language, how do you get and qualify for any social needs? Food stamps or housing programs or whatever it is. All of that needs help and assistance in transition. Job applications, language programs, ESL programs. All of those things, there's funding, there's programs available, but just trying to help them know what they are, how to get involved. And so we've got a couple young ladies. One, as a member of our church, we interviewed her on an earlier podcast. And we just said, what is it like to go and meet with these families? And they just talk about how it's just human. It's humanity. It's just,
so you don't have to speak their language.
No. They're normally, just like you might think of the first generation comes, the young generation goes to school, the young generation learns English really quickly, and they translate for their families, for their parents. So there's almost always younger translators available in all these families. And if there's not, again, a smile goes an awful long way. Just being kind to them typically opens the door. And then they're through their broken English and whatever broken words you've learned along the way, it's amazing how much you can help. You get handed a form in English, and even if you can't speak it, you can point to them. This is where you put your name, right? And they can start working their way through it. So, when you see with when we talk about the perspectives lesson, you've got this mandate that Jesus gives his people in Matthew 28, and then you kind of see the Acts version of that mandate in Acts 1:8, right? Go, you'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. And then you see kind of how it works itself out. The unleashing of the gospel was really trying to help the Jews, who were all the believers that when Jesus ascended, all of them are Jews, right? Right. Trying to help them see that it can't remain Jewish or it'll never be engaging the nations. Right. So the first 15 chapters of Acts really deals with that in a lot of different ways. Right. Even the development of the deacons is because the Hellenistic Jews, who are the non-Jewish Christians, right. Or they were the foreign Jews, and then you've got the other Jews. They're fighting over who gets the food distribution first. Right. These are foreign born, they don't count, and this whole this argument over who is in, who is out. And what do you have to do to be in, right? The whole circumcision question is part of the Galatians conversation and Paul's first journey. And all of those things bring you to this point where they removed all of the regulations that it meant to be a Jew, except for a couple that just kind of protected relationship, right? Don't eat meat, sacrifice to idols, and avoid sexual morality. All those things were trying to protect relationships between Gentiles and Jews. And then it's the gospel is unleashed. When Paul's second journey, they're going all the way to these places like Corinth and places that were so far and so different and so entirely foreign to Jewish way of life, Jewish gospel, Jewish God, Jewish heritage, and yet the gospel thrives. You know, if you go like Philippi. Right, they don't even speak. There's not a synagogue in Philippi. They don't speak any Greek, and so Paul goes there and he's working through a translator, and he finds Lydia and these ladies praying by the water, and all of a sudden you've got the Philippian church. He writes the whole book of the Philippian letter goes to this church, and you see how God moved among them in such a powerful way. And that's really what this unleashing is. But it's the same thing for us today. It's encouraging us to get beyond all of what we think holds us tight and dear, and see that there's a gospel that can transcend us. It's bigger than us. It's bigger than our Americanism. Sometimes our politics keeps us from loving people. And sometimes it's our heritage, and we say, well, we don't like those kind of people. And ethnocentrism is one of those things that you hear about. And you're like, oh, those people they hate us, so we're not going to be nice to them. Well, actually, God loves them. And somehow we've got to find this way to get beyond that. And so you think about the book of Acts just really opens the door for the gospel to go everywhere, and we're the recipients of it, right? Here, I love it that here in America, we often think that we're God's chosen people and that it started with us.
Oops, it didn't.
We're about as far away. Like we are the ends of the earth.
We are. With
Jerusalem in mind. Like when Jesus is talking to disciples, like North America is about as far away as you can get from Jerusalem, you know, and what a beautiful thing that now the gospel is so permeated our culture that this is a conversation. We have to redefine all these terms because everyone thinks they know what it means. It's so common in our culture. But still, just like you said, you've been a Christian for a long time, and understanding some of these things is new to you. You're just learning about it in the class. And so we still have the task to awaken people's hearts to the kingdom purposes that God made really clear to us.
Well, and I think some of it, don't you think, is fear? For me, I think to myself, everything I watch on the news about this people group is scary. And the reality is, I just don't know about them. And like you said, they're just people, just like us. I'm not afraid of kids, but when I think of grown-ups, they scare me a little bit more. That's why I work with kids. I think that's just a lie from Satan, trying to make me think there's something different than what they really are to stop me from even trying. The reality is it's just the unknown, right? We hang around the people that are just like us, and God's calling us to step out, to go beyond that.
There's so much, even the social dynamics of what you're talking about, you know, like they always say the bear is most dangerous in its den. You're like, this is the same kind of thing when you're seeing people in their homes where they're safe, where they're secure, where they're the most bold for their, whatever it might be, their leanings, their ideas. You take them out of that place, and all of a sudden they're much more insecure. They're exposed. They're afraid. They're nervous. Well, you think about the position of a missionary leaving that place of safety and security, going into a completely foreign environment where the people you're ministering to have that safety and security, and then trying to share with them why their thought processes need some change, In fact, we want to actually change the entire foundation, the worldview by which you live. If you accept this Jesus, he can give you so much more, but it's such a transition. Well, it's the same thing when they come here. They come into our safety, our place of strength, and then we're trying to help them find the gospel. They're exposed when they're here. So all of this idea of God calling the peoples to us and us sending people to go and get them, go and fish for them, fish for men, using my weekend sermon, it's really a dynamic and crazy process, right? The social pieces of it are wild because, again, we live here in our homes. This is our position of strength. This is a place where we have safety, security, and probably we live around people like us. We live around people that will identify with everything from our... They
don't have to learn about us.
They don't have to learn about us. You can be like, oh, you know, your grandfather did this. Oh, that's very similar. My grandfather did that too, you know, and you have those kind of conversations, but it gives us this position of strength where we are tempted to believe that everything we think is right and good and perfect. Right. And then you start encountering these other needs and you realize that God has called you away outside of that. In fact, he says these things like prefer one another, bear one another's burdens, right? Do not seek your own personal ambition, but seek the good of others around you, right? You put aside that safety and security for the sake of those that need the gospel. And it's the same challenge that those Jews were being challenged with there in the first century that we have to be challenged with here. What's it going to take for me to deny myself and follow Jesus to the cross and then bear myself, sacrifice things so that others will come to faith in Jesus. And that's the biggest challenge. Every believer has to fight through that challenge.
That's my Bible study now. Can you believe it? You just said exactly the title of the Bible study I'm doing. I think God chose it on purpose after Perspectives, right? Last class this Thursday.
The last class coming up. So everyone's like taking a deep breath. Yeah. We're almost there.
Two other things that intrigued me was I knew I've read When Helping Hurts because I come from the not-for-profit background anyway. But I loved how, to be real, we like to go into places that are unknown and think we know everything.
Yeah.
And we're going to tell people what to do, how to live, and we don't know. And I love the stories I've heard time after time where we've engaged them and they started telling their people. That's my favorite.
Like Americans, we have a reputation in the world, and that reputation is that we are solution finders. Like we fix things.
We're going to solve all their problems.
We'll solve it, we'll fix it, we'll manage it. Like those are the things that we do really well. So
and I love giving that ownership back to them. It's their community, it's their families. And I've seen that. Those stories were great. And I love that reminder. We don't know everything.
Well, think about that on a spiritual level.
Right.
Like we always want it on the poverty level, where we don't want to, what's the word? Cause dependency.
Correct.
Where we go in, we give money, we cause codependency or just straight rote dependency. Yeah. Like if you don't give us money now, we're in worse shape than we were when you started. And those are the worst stories, right? The stories where governments go in to try to bring some sort of resolution to a crisis. They dump in millions and millions of dollars. 20 years later, the people don't know how to work. They don't have their own place. They're in really rough condition. And then you have to stop the money and they don't have anything. And they're worse off than when you started. And it baffles the governments who are trying to help. And it baffles the people there saying, why are you done? You've been giving us all this money. We're not important to you anymore. Like what happened? And, and there's just this terrible thing that happens in those moments. Well, obviously the best practices that have been learned over and over again is that you want to empower people to help themselves, right? You hear the comments like a hand up, not a hand out, those kind of things. Like you want to give people the ability to as quickly as possible, get back on their own feet, right? And so that When Helping Hurts, really the whole thing is focused on how to raise people out of poverty without demeaning them, without taking away, dignity. Without taking their dignity, right? But I think the parallel is in the spiritual world. Like we do this so often where we have a professional Christian that has been professionally trained, they've gone to seminary, whatever else, they've got experience, and they're digesting scripture for everybody. Do you think about that bird that is like got the worm for its baby and it chews it all up and then it goes back to the nest and it spits it into the baby's mouth, and that's how the baby is fed? Well, it doesn't stay a baby for very long, right? It's actually a really bad problem if you have a year-old bird staying in that nest and the mom's still trying to feed it.
Very true.
And yet I feel like that's what we do so often in our faith is we want dependency. We want people to come to us and beg us to give them the nutrients of the word. And you're like, I need to teach you to read the word. Right. I need to teach you to know how to hear God's Spirit so that you can interpret the word with your own heart and mind, and then have shepherds that can speak into. And if you've got questions, then let's look deep. But we need to grow. This is the missionary task. The missionary task is not just to make disciples or make converts, it's to help them grow into fully form where they can multiply and train others. And so how much more so here when we have so much? We have so much. We have nothing. We lack nothing. We have every bit of education, tools, resources, buildings, musicians. You go down the list. We have it all.
Almost like consumerism. We have.
Oh, that's like the American world, right? Like we're so consumeristic. And so Perspectives just kind of pries you out of that just a little, right? And so it's been such a good thing. But everybody that you read about in the book of Acts is sacrificing their comforts to make disciples where the gospel had never been. Yeah. And so that really is the task. That lesson 5 is a hinge because you've really spent 5 weeks looking at all the scripture that really makes you, it overwhelms you with God's heart for the peoples. Like really it's something that you really have never seen. I had never seen until I went through Perspectives. And then you're like, okay, now what? And you start the historical section. What has God done since the apostles? Right. And then kind of how do we use our gifts and talents for his kingdom purposes now? And so, that spiritual poverty is something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about and a few little writings about, but it's something I want to unpack more as I grow in my ministry.
Yeah. I know at the previous church I was at, we had a mission field in Nicaragua, and I've had the joy of being able to see what it's been like. Not only that they shared the gospel, but they multiplied and they grew leaders, and then they provided resources for them. They make purses. They taught the ladies how to sew, and it's so wonderful.
Yeah, it
to
sounds
read
like
the
a holistic
reports.
engagement.
It is, yeah. And so then you see that we didn't come in and save them. Jesus saved them.
Yeah, of course.
But yet look how they've thrived, and they have that sense of pride and ownership, and they're following God's will for their lives, and they're sharing the gospel, and they're teaching each other, and it's so awesome.
It's like what we heard from Pastor Fred this last week. Pastor Fred from Uganda was here, and they started doing these coffee projects with families.
I loved that.
And they said in the 8 years, they go from being in really abject poverty to being middle-class Ugandans once that coffee starts being produced. 1 acre of coffee takes them from poverty to middle class.
That's got to be crazy.
It's crazy. That's crazy. And it's amazing. There's 4,000 times, like 4,000 families that have gone from,
that multiplication
from barely
thing.
making ends meet to now they're living as middle class. They can buy more property and do more trees, more coffee. They can start their own little projects. He said that some of them are buying cars now. You're like, well, these guys are the ones that walk for miles because they can't afford a motorcycle. Now they're buying. So unbelievable how the Lord has used those kind of tactics, those kind of strategies to lift people out of poverty. And obviously their spiritual life excels in that whole process. They find out what it means to be loved by God. So pretty neat stuff. That. Yeah.
Now this one's a tough one.
All right. Tough one.
All right. To our church leaders, which I hope there are some that are listening, what are some suggestions for them to make this a priority in their church? Like what could they do different? I love the church. As you talked about, even in the Philippines, sometimes churches are overwhelmed with care for people. And how does that look? Knowing that no one's really doing it wrong, but how could they enhance their church by maybe trying to find a way to focus on this to get people outside of themselves?
Yeah, there's a number of things I would say. Like one is start to share that missions responsibility with leaders, lay leaders in your church. If you don't have a missions team or missions committee, start one. And maybe a really good thing is send those to get some training. Send them to a Perspectives class if there's one local.
I like that. There's one coming, I think.
Yeah, there is one coming up. We're going to do another one in the spring. Find some way to get some people in your church adequately motivated to help lead that part of your church, especially if you're overwhelmed. You're feeling like there's just so much. I can't add one more thing. Raise up a couple leaders to do that. There's always someone in your church that has a big heart for missions. They probably drive you crazy because they're wanting their grandma to come and talk about their mission thing, or they're wanting to. But listen, like find those people, give them the tools, and then give them opportunity to start casting some vision and shepherding in that space. Secondly, I would say share authority. What do you know? Pass down authority as much as you can. As much as you can. If you feel overwhelmed, anytime you feel overwhelmed, it's an indicator of a bottleneck.
Right.
You're
probably it.
Often, leaders think they hired me for this. I can't hand it off. This is my job. If I do, I'm going to fail at my job. And all that does is put you on this pedestal where that pedestal keeps getting taller and taller and taller, and you really can never do more. You can never do enough.
Right.
And that's the honest truth. When you're home at night and you're sitting there, you're like, I'm just not enough for this. And so that's our prayer. Lord, be enough. Fill the deficiencies that I have. That's the pastor's prayer. I'm not enough for these people. So it's Moses' prayer in the desert, and so I would say pass off as much as you can. If you have a few trusted leaders, sometimes some churches have deacons or they have elders, they have lay leaders, man, give them as much as you can, as much as they possibly can handle. Teach them and train them to take on as much responsibility. So build capacity in your leadership teams so that you have capacity to start thinking about how do you engage the lost. We always tell the pastors anywhere we're doing training is that the harvest the resources are in the harvest.
Right.
And what it means by that, if your church is getting smaller or your church is getting elderly, you're starting to see there's just no way we can continue like this, then you have to engage lostness.
Right.
Otherwise, there's no hope for your church. You're in a dying space. So even if you have a nice, thriving, things are going great, if you don't have new believers coming to faith, then you're really just pulling in believers from other churches on occasion. And while that may sustain you for a season, it's not going to sustain you long term. And it's definitely not a response to the kingdom message to go and make disciples among the lost. And so build capacity. So that'd be the first two things. Help get some people in your teams trained. Give them the leadership to kind of lead in that area of missions. And then secondly, try to hand off downstream as much authority as you can. Share it. Broaden it. I think that's the biggest difficulty we have in American churches is we platform
Right.
a few leaders, and then we expect them to do a huge amount of the work. And then those leaders, like myself, we expect ourselves to do all that work. And we forget that you have a whole congregation of people that are workers. They're supposed to be mobilized for the kingdom purpose. So our job as pastors, and I'll say this all the time, is to equip our people for the work of the ministry.
Right.
If you're doing the work of the ministry, you're not equipping your people.
Well, they say great leaders are always surrounded by great people, right? Because you can't do it by yourself. I will say, we hadn't talked about this, but I'm super thrilled about the team that you have developed here at FBC. When I see that team, they are just all sold for Jesus on this missions thing.
This is an amazing
so
church,
awesome.
and those people are amazing people. I am so blessed to have those team members. And, when I came here, it was like 7 or 8, and now we're pushing 20, and that's going to grow to probably 25 this year. And so, again, the capacity, we're trying to gain capacity.
Right.
And there's so many areas we're failing. I feel it. I feel the pressure.
Right.
Communication with our partners and about our partners, trying to tell stories to our church. In that, you've got all the funding that's going in different directions.
Right.
You've got events that are happening. We've got mission trips that are going and coming. It's overwhelming.
Right.
And the only way we can do this is to have people that are great people investing themselves far more hours that they invest than I can possibly invest.
And I love that, because it's actually the solution you suggested for church members is what you're doing. And that's what's the capacity
Step
is
one,
increased.
got to build capacity. I've got to get more people helping
it.
me do this.
I love it. All right. So to the everyday church member, the lay person, what is their call to action? What does God's word tell them to do? What are things you would tell them to do? I know for me, I would say, take the Perspectives class.
Yeah, guys, it's expensive and it's heavy. It's not for everyone, but for those of you that feel interested in it, take it. Like there's 3 levels. You can take it for certificate, which is the kind of the middle level, but it's heavy. It's a lot of reading. It's a lot of homework. Teresa's been taking it that level. Quite a few of our members have taken that level. But the lower level is just come, you do some of the reading, you listen to the instructors, you just fill out kind of your opinion on the class 5 times through the class. It's fairly light. It's like auditing a college course. You can just kind of go and listen. And then you can take it for college credit, which is like the full meal. You're going to read everything. You're going to have a midterm and a final, and it's a major thing. And we have one student doing that. And that's super exciting. She's going to know more about perspectives than me when she finishes class, and that's incredible. So all of that to say, the perspectives piece is definitely a good next step if you're wondering how to get involved. How do you grow in your capacity and understanding of what God's doing? But that is a lofty. Like, I think I'm fairly sure that like probably less than 10% of Christians will actually take a class like that. And so for those of you who are like, I just don't know if I can handle that. Here's some simple things. Like the first one I would say is abide deeply in Jesus. Like spend time daily in God's word and in prayer. Elevate the lost that you know to prayer every day. Make them a priority in your prayers so that you're constantly asking the Lord to give you opportunities to love them in Jesus' name, to speak Jesus' name in front of them, to pray for their needs, and be the letter that God wrote to the world to them, right? Like that Ephesians, 1 Corinthians 5 passage we're looking at, 2 Corinthians 5 passage, where I am ambassadors. And so I would say that. So the first thing, abide deeply. Stay connected to Jesus. You can't give what you don't have. Right?
Very true.
Secondly, elevate those people who are far from you. And then third, like this is a free 1-day training we do as often as we can called Gospel Conversations. It just teaches you really simple ways to present the gospel to those around you. Often it's just in asking them, prayer, care, share. How can I pray for you? How can I care for you? And Lord, give me an opportunity to share with them, right? It's something really, really simple. And we do those every so often. We have one coming up here in May 22nd. If you're interested, we'd love to have you sign up for that. So just, I said it on Sunday, like get involved, get off the bench, right? Get in the game, put your net in the water. Like they're all the same metaphor to try to just say our job's not to just, sit and listen forever. It's to be actively involved in the work of taking the gospel to those who don't have it. So,
and I know for families with kids, we started out with just picking 3 people that we didn't think knew Jesus, and we prayed for them every night at our dinner table, different people. That was just introducing them. What do you mean they don't know Jesus?
I love that.
When you're a kid, you're kind of like, well, you hear the story about Jesus and God loved us, and he said, why would people not want Jesus. And I'm like, well, people choose. It is a choice.
So this year, we just recently added Amanda Farah is my co-host for this season for the class, for the podcast.
Right.
And as we're going through, we're going to have a theme that's called Family on Mission.
Oh, good.
And the whole theme is focused on this idea of how do we engage and incorporate our family,
right,
and how do we incorporate people who are in our neighborhood who love Jesus as a part of our family. Right. So the Family on Mission is not just your nuclear family, but your family begins to expand. Right. And you see that all throughout Scripture, that the family of the body of Christ is much bigger than you and your wife and kids. They're a part of it, of course, but starting to engage and move incrementally outwards just increases what that family looks like. So, I love that. I love that you're including your kids and praying for the lost. What a great model that is for them, and hopefully it'll help them kind of have those disciplines in life as well. Yeah,
because they're living in that environment we talked about where they're around other Christian people going to our church. They don't really understand that. We did also sponsor a child through and actually we watched our child graduate, because I have two 19-year-olds and a 20-year-old now. So she graduated now and is off to college, and we sponsored her. So now we have a new little boy, but it's fun now because they're actually writing him letters, not me.
What organization did you guys sponsor through?
You know who I'm sponsoring for. Did you want to tell them a little bit about it?
No, I just want you to say it.
Food for the Hungry.
Oh, I've never heard of those guys.
Yes, you have. They're his favorite. I really am loving them. They do such a great job of allowing us to connect with our child. And again, I do it all online. So I send him letters and they translate it to him. And then he sends me letters and I can see his handwriting, but they translate it. And it's really cool. Our little boy is in Bolivia. So
I have had a Food for the Hungry little spiel prepared since week 8 to share with Perspectives, our class, just so they would know about it. And there's not been one place for it.
But tell them why you love them so much.
That's not what the podcast is about, but Food for the Hungry is by far, in my experience, the best organization to partner with for poverty alleviation.
Right.
Their child sponsorship program targets a specific area, and they'll take hundreds of kids from one area and get sponsors for them. But by doing so, they're trying to lift the entire community out of poverty. And so my last church, we did it's called a church to community agreement, C2C agreement, church to community agreement. And our goal was that within 10 years, we would see a community that was 25,000 people lifted out of poverty. So our church sponsored 200 plus kids over a season, but we also partnered with them and did some projects in the community, like a water project and some things like that. And so in that 10-year relationship with the community, it was just incredible to watch how the community was transforming. And the community owns the process. So they're the ones that identify what's their first needs, what's their biggest. It's not the Americans coming in and say, we're going to do this. One of the communities, the first thing they wanted was a soccer field, and we thought they were insane. You need clean water. Why do you want a soccer field? And then you realize they didn't have a place for the community to gather. They didn't have a place for the community to be. And the soccer field became the place where they gathered all the time. So all the conversations, the businessmen and the the church is all there together, watching their kids, playing with each other, and that became kind of the community core. So they needed a place for the community to be the community before they needed us to fix their water, and it was anyway so powerful. We learned so many things.
When I loved it, my little guy sends me a note, and we're talking about him looking at Bolivia and all this, and he's like, "Thank you so much for praying for me. I would like to pray for you. How can I pray for you?" And I'm like, "Oh, that is so sweet." We've
had a couple FH kids for a long time. So fh.org, if you don't know what I'm talking about, you can check it out.
Little plug for them. I'd love to say that I didn't do it because Toby Mack asked me to and I was being cool, but that is why I started it. But I do love them as an organization.
When Teresa says Toby Mack asked her, it wasn't like he asked a whole bunch. He actually talked to her about it.
Well, no, he probably talked to my brother. But anyway, good concert. Check it out. Anyway.
We're dropping some names here at the last bit. Well, hey, seriously, thank you so much for jumping on here with me, Teresa. These are great questions. This is so different than what I would have done by myself. So I'm so glad that you helped. It's exciting. We're so, again, thankful for you.
Yeah, well. I'm thankful for you.
Oh, thanks. For those of you listening, thank you for tuning in. 52 minutes on the clock right now, so it's a long podcast. I hope that you've enjoyed all of it. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to reach out to us here at FBC. We would love to hear from you and get some feedback. Remember why we do this. It's not just so that you guys could have a good time on your car ride to work or back. It's really so that we can understand that God blesses us so that we can be a blessing to those around us. So have a wonderful day, and God bless. We are so thankful that you joined our podcast today. We would love to hear any feedback you may have for us. Remember, Psalm 67 says, "May God be gracious to us and bless us, and make his face shine on us, so that your ways may be known on earth and your salvation among all nations. Don't forget why the Lord blesses us. It's so that we can be a blessing to those around us. Until next time, God bless.